All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to Europe Responds. We're here for our third episode of this series, in which today we talk about protecting Europe from the economic policies and their effects of Beijing and Washington. And I'm very happy to be joined by my good friend and colleague Joris Teer, who is the Economic Security and Technology Analyst at the USS. How are you, Joris?
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me, Giuseppe.
Thank you so much. And I know that this topic really interests you. We're going to discuss economic security more generally and basically the position of Europe being in sort of, as we said, between a rock and a hard place right now, between the US tariffs on the one hand and China's overcapacity and policies on the other. And of course, at the same time, in the context of a war in the eastern side of the continent. Now, let's start as we have planned with the discussion of the tariffs that the US imposed in the world. Of course, we're not to focus too much on what everybody already knows about when the tariffs were imposed and what they are about, but briefly, just for our listeners to sort of catch up and be on the same page, we know that there's been a series of changes in the US tariff policies. First started with initial tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. They were followed by specific sector-specific tariffs, specifically on steel and aluminium, which are still in place. And then the big news happened at the beginning of this month with Liberation Day. So reciprocal tariffs that were put on a lot of countries around the world. They were actually then put in pause after 1 week. But of course, some baseline tariffs remained. Europe currently faces 10% tariffs vis-a-vis the US, plus the previously imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium. At the same time, though, the US increased the tariffs on China because China was the only country that retaliated immediately, and therefore that led to levies up to 145%, although some sectors are removed and so on. So this has been significant, and there's been significant changes also in effects on the U.S. economy. But generally, let's start by sort of focusing on the effects that go beyond trade. So we know that trade is significantly being affected by this, but your expertise is economic security. So why do we care about tariffs beyond the pure issue of free trade?
Yeah, thanks, Giuseppe. So it all comes down to having or not having a manufacturing base. And I think in a globalized world, there's a lot to say for having a manufacturing base. It
Right.
goes hand in hand with prosperity, it goes hand in hand with employment. And because of that, of course, the social services that through taxes a state can provide. But in an era of great power competition, of course, a manufacturing base has many more purposes. The first, it gives you control over all of the stuff you need to be able to produce to, well, deter adversaries, like you said. And now that there's increasing uncertainty about what the NATO guarantee of the US still means, this is, of course, even more urgent. It's not just being able to produce weapon systems, but it's able to produce anything really that go into the weapon systems, ranging from critical raw materials to semiconductors to all sorts of other electronics. Etc. So really, the first point is you have to be able to produce. It doesn't all need to be produced in Europe, of course. It can be produced as well in sort of trusted jurisdictions, both like-minded partners and non-like-minded partners. But you need to have access to these critical economic inputs to maintain your deterrence. Because if you don't have that, you don't have the ability to fight a long war. And if the adversary knows you don't have the ability to fight a long war, that is an enormous deterrence gap right there. So that is sort of the first additional function that manufacturing has. And there are two important additional ones.
Yeah, all right. So then we will go into the other ones in a second. But of course, this is very important because we're moved away from the paradigm of globalization and interdependence. Of course, this has been a big part of Trump's electoral manifesto, and we know it's a position that many in his administration hold on to. But of course, there's also, since we see that there's a back and forth, and Trump also likes deals, one of the argument that have been made recently is that really this is about trying to remove China from this manufacturing base. Because, for instance, one of the points that have been made recently that Trump made himself is that which we want to make deals so that other countries exclude China from it. So perhaps do you see that excluding China is really the goal of the U.S. manufacturing or the U.S. tariffs in general?
Yeah, so I think you're definitely right about the first bit. The US is extremely explicit about the great power logic of manufacturing, and in the president's trade policy agenda, it laments that right now the US is dependent on fragile international value chains, and that much of America's industrial might has disappeared, and now innovation has started to go with it. And it puts this in a historic context where it's super explicit that the US was able to win 2 world wars and also defeat communism because it had this arsenal of democracy, this grand manufacturing base. So there is definitely a focus of at least part of the establishment, and also reflected in official documents, that this should be reversed. Well, if you then look at the second part of the argument, who actually then took part of that manufacturing base from the US perspective, it's clearly China. In 2020, China produced 35% of all manufactured goods globally. And according to the United Nations, this is meant to go up to 45% by 2030. So the US, in its policy documents and in its strategy, is pretty explicit that China is the main culprit here. And in Brussels, we also hear some anecdotal evidence that some member states have already been approached by the US, saying reciprocal tariffs are a means to, in the end, exclude China. Why? Because both the EU and the US are frogs that are being boiled by China's manufacturing strategy and its unfair below market price competition. And we should stand up against that together. And part of the US administration is at least convinced that the only way in which you get the Europeans to move is by being really forceful and putting all these reciprocal tariffs also against us in place, including the pause to then change our policies.
Well, that's indeed a very interesting, the change in the position. Perhaps, of course, in the past 4 years under Joe Biden's presidency, there was a pressure. The issue of economic security had become front and center in a lot of transatlantic conversation. And I believe that, at least in some areas, the European Union was trying to lock steps with the US in trying to put together a trusted manufacturing base, trusted supply chains, and specifically to try to lock in the US, specifically in the defense industry of Europe. Now, a lot of these things are under questioning because, yes, I see your logic there, but also in Europe, this is also seen as sort of a realization that the US might want to go alone and maybe leave the European allies behind. What are your thoughts on this?
I think you're exactly right. So I give the United States credit for being a lot more clear-eyed about the actual risk and how quickly this is moving in China's direction. It's already the largest in total volumes producers of semiconductors at 23%. China produces the majority of all the materials, the majority of the materials that the European Commission deems critical, with all of the defense end users that are vital, such as radar, satellites, sensors, drones, frigates, etc., etc. And that extends far beyond the defense realm. That goes into the medical realm as well, the green realm, the digital realm. So I give the US a lot of credit for saying the costs of doing nothing are enormous. But with sort of the uncertainties that have now come with the Trump administration that does seek to address these imbalances, it is very difficult for the EU to sign up, of course, for sort of a joint transatlantic de-risking strategy. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, even if we just faced the risk of US abandonment of either Ukraine or worse, even NATO, you could still make the argument that it's great to have a joint manufacturing base, as long as that manufacturing base grows and as long as the US really puts in some of its key strengths, as it has moved much more quickly than we have on some of these de-risking topics. We could still say that's in our interest. But of course, sort of the pressure and the stipulations and the intentions around Greenland are very murky. And we have the same problem, of course, that now we don't just face the risk of US abandonment of Ukraine, but perhaps even US economic pressure to make sure that the EU sort of lifts its sanction as well. And I personally think that is that's not the main scenario by far, but the fact that this has become conceivable makes any joint manufacturing, joint reindustrialization a lot more problematic than it was just 3 months ago.
Exactly. So then this is part of the general question of trust. Allies, they cooperate and they accept perhaps to carry some burden of the cost if they receive in exchange a guarantee that, for instance, that the interests are the same and that there will be a mutual defense eventually. But of course, as you are saying, these are a big question marks for now, and that's what the conversation we're hearing in Europe, around Europe for now. But let's now talk about the other side of the coin. So we talked about the US right now. Why don't we focus a bit on China? You already mentioned some of it. It's long-term strategy to build a self-reliant economic fortress. I wanted to ask you if in the context of the return of Trump and the new tariffs, China is pursuing this even further. Of course, some of the policies that it has adopted perhaps are a result of many years of planning for this. But I wonder whether you feel that there's some strategic changes or they are pursuing the ultimate goal of self-reliance.
Yeah, so I think the lodestar and the long-term aim has remained constant for very long. And if you even go back to 2015, when Made in China 2025 was published, it's sort of grand industrial policy to become leading in a lot of the key sectors of the future. It already says in the preamble of that document that without a ground manufacturing base, there can't be a country or a nation. And it puts that very specific quote in the context of really the rise and fall of great power since the mid 18th century. So the place where manufacturing and industrialization really took off. And then if you move forward to 2020, I mean, Xi Jinping took that even further. He didn't just say we need to increase self-reliance in science and technology and in all sorts of other manufacturing bases. No, at the very start of the pandemic, he explicitly says that China needs to deepen the dependence of international production chains on China. And this is part of Chinese deterrence and deterrence against foreigners who would otherwise cut off supply to China. So you see sort of the real distrust there on the Chinese side quite early on. Which brings me to the other side of that coin. It's also a strategy for economic development, as most sort of hardcore mercantilist protectionist policies have always been. So the subsidies are at very large scale. There's also smart infrastructure investments. We have really a proliferation now of even more extreme local content requirements. There's a great recent Merrick's report on overcapacities that I really can recommend. And what they say is the overcapacities were already there. We know them from the traditional sectors like steel production, mining, etc. But in the next stage, the stage we're now in, and this is why it's really going to hurt for Europe, we're looking at overcapacities through these unfair market practices in industrial machinery, in semiconductors, and in all sorts of other industries, high-end medical devices, that Europe is traditionally very strong in as well.
Excellent. So let's delve into this, Joris. Let's try to understand what has China done recently in the last few, just in the last few months. But understand some of these are sort of an expansion of pre-existing measures that were taken. And why do they matter so much? Because one would say, okay, these are only in response to the United States, but why do they matter to Europe?
Yeah, I mean, there's two reasons. One is because it's sort of eating our manufacturing base from the inside out. And the first problem there we've addressed. You need a big manufacturing base to be able to deter, because you need to produce a total volume of goods. But you need a big manufacturing base for two more reasons. One is that key specialties within manufacturing, they give you strategic indispensability. They give you control over certain choke points, or at least important spots in the global economy, that you can use as pressure as well to make sure that, or at least to try to disincentivize, I don't know, military adventurism in East Asia by China, or China's weaponization of value chains. And then finally, innovation doesn't just happen behind laptops. It happens in manufacturing. So there's a constant interchange between civilian industries and military industries in terms of new achievements. And if you look specifically at the risks of our deindustrialization, that's sort of the third big risk, that we miss the whole automatization of our industries, the sort of rise of robotics in production.
Yeah.
And these robotics, of course, can be used sort of to deter again as well. So on the manufacturing part, that is my main concern. But China did something else, of course, too. It introduced even more export controls on the critical raw materials that we need for everything, basically.
Can
and
we
this is
talk about
really
a couple of this? Can we talk about a couple of these critical materials?
Absolutely. So this has been an ongoing dynamic where each time that the United States introduces new technology controls on the Chinese or tariffs, the Chinese respond by putting more of these critical raw materials on their export controls. And what is good to realize is that all of these critical raw materials combined are really best described as the skeleton of the world economy. If you pull that out, nothing works anymore. You don't have your wind turbines, you don't have your MRI technologies, you don't have your drones, you don't have your fighter jets, etc. Well, gradually among these steps, the dynamic is very clear. Every time the United States does this, China puts more on their export controls. But right now, and that's the beginning of this month, in the response to reciprocal tariffs, China has really taken the next big step. It placed 7 heavy rare earths, these 7 heavy rare earths, on their export controls, and for the licensing period, scrapped exports altogether. And this includes the production of a key component, which is called a permanent magnet. And if you look at the uses of those things, I mean, it's really in anything you need for defense: smart bombs, radar systems, missiles, drones, the F-35 fighter jet, but it's also in AI chips, it's in electric vehicles, etc., etc. So this might be a super small and quite polluting industry, but again, if you pull that out of the manufacturing base, you're in a world of pain. It undermines our deterrence, and it undermines our ability to produce more generally.
Yes, indeed, and that of course affects. I mean, one question would be how soon are we going to see that effect? One could say that probably we might be seeing pretty soon, if not already. And generally, the problem that you were saying also about innovation is a big one, because of course China is also one of the leaders in research in areas such as quantum, for instance. And you were mentioning the fact that the US has had this advantage in manufacturing that will also spilled over on the civilian sectors, examples such as DARPA and the creation of Silicon Valley and so on. There is a risk that Europe is also cut out for the next innovation cycle. And indeed, you were mentioning the fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it really has two sides. So with China's export controls on critical raw materials, it still remains to be seen whether they're going to reissue exports, whether they're going to allow it, give the licenses, etc. I mean, one scenario is that China very specifically will say, these are 27 US defense contractors and the US military, they are not supposed to have these materials anymore. So we do a targeted ban against these producers, and you sort of see a couple of indications that that's the first direction that they want to take. So even Korean producers of key components, which are then produced with Chinese materials, have already gotten letters saying, well, you won't receive your materials anymore as long as you give these components to US military producers. So there's already pressure and sort of an oil spill that more and more producers are affected by sort of a targeted ban. But what I'm personally really worried about is that China, maybe rightly, will conclude, listen, any critical raw materials or components that are exported outside of our borders, whether they go to Malaysia, Canada, Europe, etc., will end up in the US anyway. This is an independent, simple product. Once it leaves your borders, it's very difficult to track where it goes. And if it really feels that this is the time to escalate and undermine US defense production, well, it might reduce export volumes across the board a lot more broadly, which then, given that our defense industries are also sort of integrated with the United States, will undermine us a lot as well. Well, the Chinese had these industries, they kept innovating, and our main problem, I mean, it's a two-sided problem. One, it will take us years, if not decades, to reopen mines. And two, China has kept innovating in refining technologies for these products. And these are a lot of technologies, as you say, that we unfortunately no longer control or are no longer in the possession of ourselves.
Well, yes, indeed. So basically, you're pointing to certain directions that are paradoxical for Europe, and that's why we called it between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, the US that is pushing Europe through various means, and one of the goals might be to remove China from its value chains through the threat of secondary sanctions and also the tariffs. And at the same time, China that is on the one hand potentially seeing us, given that we are US allies, as a potential source of threat, and using its leverage towards us to drive a wedge in the transatlantic relationship. So in the one hand, we are basically stuck between these two situations. And you're saying before, there's little industrialization in Europe. So the question would be, how do we move on from this? What can Europe do to turn the tide? In the past, one would have said we strengthen ties with the United States. And now, given the context that we live in, one would say that maybe this is not the most viable policy. I'm not sure. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we are in an incredible dilemma in which two words play a key role. On the one hand, there's trust, as you said. Can we still trust the Americans, given that there's now also a scenario that they might actively economically pressure us to get some concessions on our Ukraine policy, for instance? But on the other side, there's capabilities. What can you produce, and who is in the best position to actually reindustrialize and make sure that we have a greater stake there? And even though that at this very moment our manufacturing base is broader than the United States, it's very clear that we're in a world of pain. I mean, our energy prices are now 4 to 5 times higher than in the United States as a result of Putin turning off the gas taps, but also our own decisions to turn off nuclear power plants, to reduce gas production in Europe, etc., etc. So we're incredibly expensive to do energy intensive production, while the US is gaining a lot of these things that we have with the whole thing of a drill baby drill policy to lower energy prices even further. And if you take that into the case study of critical raw materials, specifically rare earths, I mean, the US has already reopened the Mountain Pass mine in California. It's really quite extraordinary that within 12 years they moved back from 0% to 12% of global mining production for rare earths. I mean, the DoD right now says that all the way from the mine up till the permanent magnets, and there's a lot of difficult steps in between, that by 2027 it expects to produce enough to suffice at least the entire US defense industrial base. Well, I'm absolutely not saying Europe is doing nothing. We have the Critical Raw Materials Act. We now have 47 strategic projects that we're working on. But if you specifically look at the rare earth mining bit, in terms of full production, these projects are likely only going to come to fruition in the mid-2030s. And that's even if everything goes according to plan. So this really shows the dilemma. On the one hand, you have a lack of trust because of contingencies that weren't possible before, such as economic pressure over them wanting to accept our Ukraine policy. But on the other hand, you have the real problem of capabilities. How do we make sure that not just the US reindustrializes, but also we?
Yeah, and of course, on that point, the one of the answers that is often being mentioned is the fact of looking at like-minded partners, right? So looking at countries that are willing and will first of all have those deposits of rare earths and critical raw materials, and that can be trusted, and therefore do a production process through them. Now, my question would be, of course, the United States was a key part of that. Can we still do a G7 plus style agreement on securing supply chains? Of course, you would also need to count other countries in the world, which we may not consider as like-minded, but are essential in the potential in this chain. What are your thoughts on this?
I think we can, and it might not have the formal label here as a G7 plus partner agreement on getting back to critical raw materials, even though I don't exclude the possibility that might move forward still as well. But other important parties like Japan is the only other party outside of China that already produces these permanent magnets that I spoke about that go into all this weapon equipment, at least at a decent scale. Australia, Japan has done a lot of targeted investment in Australia already for the last 10 to 14 years in an Australian mining company called Lynas, making Australia one of the sort of producers of rare earths too. So there's definitely strengths among like-minded partners that we should make use of, but we should also, as Europe, really make a good assessment of what our strengths and weaknesses are. And I think one key strength that we have is we're good for a lot of the rare earth / permanent magnet demand. We are a continent that takes the green transition very seriously. We're building offshore wind turbines. We're actually putting them in place. Well, every offshore wind turbine has 12,000 kilograms of permanent magnets, or at least of one particular model that's often used. So if you change our public procurement procedures and you would actually have buy like-minded requirements that say, well, in the tender procedures, if you want to build an offshore wind turbine park and you use European or Japanese or Australian magnets, we're going to award you additional points. I mean, these are, of course, things that we can play with. And luckily, something that the European Commission is thinking about to introduce next year. There's other avenues that you can take as well. All of these countries have now really, for the first time in a long while, ring-fenced a lot of money for long-term strategic gains, namely through our defense funds. And all of this sort of stuff can really kickstart production, both in Europe and in like-minded countries as well. To give you an example, how the Department of Defense in the US beat Chinese below market prices in rare earths was just to give, I think it was $100 million to start up the Mountain Pass mine again from defense funds. So you compete by making a public investment up front, and then you ask civilian sectors to take off these products as well. So there's a lot of alignment we can still do, even if it doesn't get the official G7 plus partner label.
Right, of course. And it's quite important that you were pointing at the fact that many of these sectors are, especially in Europe, incipient or economically potentially unfeasible. So there is a demand there for government or EU funds to step in for the first step and then to get the machine rolling indeed. Then one last thing before concluding, I wanted to ask if you're worried about concerns of supply chain disruptions, because of course this is usually regarding the concept of a crisis in East Asia, and that's whether that would also put the idea of like-mindedness in jeopardy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's an even more extreme scenario that we should definitely take into account. So the world is already holding its breath right now because China put all of these critical raw materials on their export controls, and right now it's not exporting. And it's not exporting because of the licenses and going through that, etc. I mean, the first escalation, as mentioned before, would be China trying to guarantee that nothing ends up in the US, so it squeezes exports. It really reduces the permanent magnet supply to the rest of the world, giving us enormous deterrence gaps in terms of ammunition production, weapon production, etc. It will also have make an enormous blow to our wind turbine producers, again benefiting Chinese producers instead unfairly. But of course, there is a scenario that is more extreme, but one that, given China's rapid military modernization, its grander exercises around Taiwan, etc., we should really take into account. And that is the scenario that you actually have a military conflict in East Asia, leading to, well, first of all sorts of supply chain issues because semiconductors can't get it from Taiwan anymore. But the second rung of consequences being that either the EU will feel compelled to put its own sanctions on China, or the US taking out sort of the extraterritorial whip and banning the exports of all sorts of European goods to China. To which China will likely respond by then saying, well, we hoarded all this medicine, we hoarded all these critical raw materials, etc. They won't leave our borders anymore at all. So, I mean, my conclusion really is, if you look at this minefield, really the minefield that we're looking at in terms of critical raw material futures, for everyone, it should become unacceptable that we can only defend ourselves in Europe as long as China allows us to have these materials and these key components. Right. And this is the reality in which we live today.
Exactly. It is important to keep that in mind as a key part of the discussion on Europe's competitiveness, but also Europe's security. We need to have the means to defend ourselves. Well, with that, we unfortunately ran out of time. So I want to thank Joris for running through this excellent exercise and for telling us all about these key elements and this important thoughts on critical raw materials and economic security. And we wish all of our listeners a good start of the week, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next episode of Europe Responds. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe.
Bye.